Hello, this is Mike Solosi. Before we get to this week's Retro Encounter, I have a quick public service announcement for you. Retro Encounter is changing its episode numbering system. Our old way made sense at first, identifying episodes by the different games that we played on the show, but almost 2 years and over 15 bonus rounds later, it's gotten confusing. We've had over 60 episodes, but last week's was officially Retro Encounter 22. That doesn't make sense. So, from now on, we're identifying episodes by their true numbers and not their game numbers. Today is episode 67, next week will be episode 68, and so on. We're also getting rid of the bonus round title and just calling each episode by their number and title. We're not changing the format of the show, however. It's still going to be 2 game-specific episodes each month, with the rest of the month filled out by off-topic themed episodes or news episodes. Basically whatever we feel like. All that's changing are their numbers. But that's enough. Thanks for hearing me out, folks. Listen on for Retro Encounter 67.
We shall overcome. We shall overcome. Lord, we shall overcome someday. We are not afraid.
What's up, everyone? Welcome to a very interesting and special episode of Retro Encounter. I'm your host, Josh Curry, but you won't be hearing me talk much. For this special episode, we have the wonderful Chris Gebauer,
What's up, everyone?
and we are going to hear an interesting take on things. We a lot of times talk about video games on this podcast. A lot of times it is stuff that is older. Occasionally we touch on some kind of more newer things. But we really don't ever hit on any kind of politics or how things work in the industry. You might hear me make fun of hey, they should have made this game this way, but we don't actually get into the weeds of how games are made and kind of the logistics of that. But the wonderful thing is, Chris is actually in the acting world. He has done some voice work. And so we're today going to talk about kind of some of the voice acting strikes, how that all works in the politics, what makes sense, what doesn't, and kind of our general feeling on it. But for the most part, I'm going to let Chris explain it because he has the wonderful perspective of actually being on that side. So,
Yay.
yeah.
I'm technically on strike.
Whoa! Strike it up.
Guess, right? It's weird because there's always, every year, the union has something on strike. It's just usually not this big. Usually it's people actually trying to screw others over. And this is a weird one. So we're talking about the voiceover strike that targets very specific companies. It's not it's not SAG as a whole striking against the entire video game industry, which I think a lot of people always kind of just assume it is. In fact, the notice, and every notice I've been given, lists Activision, Blindlight, Core of Discovery Films, which I haven't looked into, but I'm sure the connect there is, it as just a publishing label. VoiceWork Productions, which is a studio that gets used to do voice work. WB Games, Take-Two Interactive, Insomniac, Formosa, Electronic Arts, Disney Character Voices, Inc., and I'm missing one, Interactive Associates, Incorporated. So some of those are
weirdest direction along that list.
I did. Well, I know you're reading through. I tried to just hit the major games names that everyone would know, and then I realized, well, people, if they're going to do their research, are going to know that there's a few other companies, so I should read them all. So I tried to start with the obvious ones and then work my way down to the companies that no one's going to know about.
At the end of the day, they have two of the most important because they have Activision and EA.
Yep, and EA. And what I don't know, because I'm not in negotiations, there's people who do this, is they're going on strike against the whole company but it could very much be because of how certain divisions and certain divisions only function. Like something with Activision, it could be how Activision has handled, let's say, the Call of Duty franchise and those studios specifically. It could have nothing to do with Blizzard. But since they're one entity, it's Activision Publishing. And it is interesting because it's Activision Publishing, not Activision. So it's that kind of, what are you targeting within the company? Like Insomniac, that was a weird one to me. I'm sure that has to do with, I'm going to guess it has something to do with Song of the Deep or something like that.
That one actually surprised me because Insomniac's kind of part of that team from back in the PS2 games, PS2 days with like Naughty Dog. And you always hear such fantastic things about Naughty Dog. And Insomniac was always kind of like pseudo attached at the hip because they had you had the Jack and Dexter, Ratchet and Clank, and Sly Cooper games.
Ratchet and Clank.
Like those.
Yep. And then before that, it was Spyro and Crash.
Right, and like what you always heard coming out of that was these three teams, although they're three separate teams, they share so much. It's almost like they're the same entity, right?
Yeah.
And then, granted, you fast forward 15 years or whatever, you hear only the best things about Naughty Dog, and then to see Insomniac on the list, yeah, that definitely surprised me.
Well, and again, I'm sure it all comes down to, and that's what's hard to separate, is it looks like, oh my god, Insomniac Games, you're on this list, you've done something. I'm sure they've done, especially again, going to what the agreement has been, you know, the previous collective bargaining, whatever you want to call it, the previous agreement, I'm sure they were never in violation of anything. It's just that they haven't agreed to the current sticking points of the union, and that's why they're on this list. So it's also that weird thing of these companies have done nothing wrong, technically. It's the other thing that kind of needs to be made clear. The only reason why there's a strike against them is because the union wants them to agree to certain terms moving forward. They believe, you know, the way things have been going isn't fair to the constituents of the union, and this is what we want, which we'll get into pretty much immediately after I finish this point. So everyone could have, you know, everyone here on this list, WB Games, Insomniac, Activision, EA, Disney, these are all people who could be Take-Two. Well, Take-Two is a huge, you know, publishing company as well, but they're all probably have done everything right except now for what the union wants.
Right. Yeah,
so it's not these are bad people or they're screwing anyone over. It's just now they're in violation of what the union is trying to accomplish.
Right. They're following the rules that are currently placed. They're not in violation of that.
No.
Taking the next
so there's
steps
no real
forward.
mishandling of people or really doing anything wrong, even though it's very easy to, and again, how strikes work, it is very much us versus them. So it always comes across as a huge fuck you. And sorry, I'm swearing, but
No,
I'm sure I'm going to
fine.
slip a lot with this one because it's a weird topic.
We'll stamp a mature tag. Okay. Yeah, this actually
Thank you.
This gets so murky because
It's
as
so
somebody
murky.
completely outsider to this, you always have like evil company of the year and hey, EA won again, and then you see like, oh, look at this, the voice actors are so upset, and it's like, well, based on all this terrible things I've heard, EA must be treating them terribly, like, and then you start hearing things about this like, oh, this actually doesn't sound terrible, it sounds like they're being treated moderately well, and then you hear the other element of, all right, well, the voice actors aren't happy, so they don't want to be doing this, but also they're going to say, like, we want special rights because we should be treated better, but really we're doing this because we're going to help the designers and the developers and the programmers.
Yeah, I don't like that argument. We'll get into that,
hate
but I
that
think that argument is absolute horseshit. And one thing that I thought was fascinating, timing-wise, is IGN, I think it was the last Unfiltered they did, Ryan McCaffrey, when he interviews execs and former execs at major companies and talks about their history in the industry and their effect on the industry. And he had Jason Rubin on, talking about Naughty Dog, one of the founders. And of course, Jason Rubin, his whole story is fascinating in terms of how he started making games, how young he was. And then, of course, he started Naughty Dog, co-founded it, which is the studio. I mean, say what you will about the games they make. Naughty Dog is one of the few studios that people, once they start working there, that's it. You reach the mountain. People don't leave. Or they traditionally don't leave Naughty Dog. That's where you end up. That's how people think of it. And Rubin, at one point, it's brought up, talking about unionizing as an industry. And Rubin mentions this is about, this is before he left Naughty Dog, so it's the Jack and Daxter days, the Jack 2 era Naughty Dog. And he's like, there was actually a meeting that we held. And he says we, and he means it was me and the heads of about 8 other major studios. And we quietly, like it was at a restaurant or somewhere. And it was basically, they sit for a night. I'm sure these conversations have been going on for a while, but they had this one meeting that he references where it was, should we make this a thing? Should we unionize? Because now's the time. If we do it, this is the moment in terms of how everything's going. And they all talked it through and said, the way this business works, the way the model we're working with, and the way it's going to keep developing, no, it doesn't make sense. It's not going to help us out. Now, of course, that was then. Things change. But it was a very interesting perspective to hear amidst to what you were calling about, like, oh, we're doing this for everyone else too. It's like, bullshit. No, you're not. You're saying that because it makes your cause look more righteous.
Right.
That is not the intent. I will read off the intent because I have the friggin' letter from my union. So, the issues, quote unquote, that we're dealing with here are, again, far simpler than people, I think, traditionally realize. The big one is secondary compensation. And what that means is what the union, what SAG-AFTRA is trying to accomplish, and it's SAG-AFTRA now because the unions merged a couple years back. So even though everyone's going to say SAG, it's technically SAG-AFTRA now. AFTRA stands for the American Film and Television Radio Association, I believe. And if I got that wrong, someone's going to correct me. So yay for Twitter. So the big thing is this idea of secondary compensation. So a bonus. The actual lettering in the letter is, we're asking for a reasonable performance bonus for every 2 million copies or downloads sold. So for each 2 million unique subscribers to an online game, and there's a cap at 8 million. The idea being that there would be a payout at maximum 4 times. 2 million, 4 million, 6 million, 8 million, that's it. So the wording here is that shakes out to 4 session payments per principal performer. So I'm going to stop there before, and we'll break that down, because a lot of people think that this is a royalties thing in the traditional sense of royalties, and it's not even close. Normally, the idea of a royalty is every time something is in usage, you get paid. So if a show's syndicated, that's the holy grail in this business.
Right.
If a show's syndicated, that means every time it's put on the air, each performer within the show, if they're within that episode, has a cut, basically. So the more successful your show, or the more important it is, or whatever the time slot it's being bought for, the more prime time, the bigger that number is going to be. So the point where some people still get checks of, every month, even though their show was a decade ago, it's still a few thousand.
Right. That was my favorite, was always Seinfeld.
Oh yeah, but there are people who still forever get paid because of how many times that's been syndicated. But at the same time, like guy who was a big influence on me, Stan Cahill, a theater teacher who had a pretty good career out in LA as always doing guest stars. And it was between him and Perry for Chandler and Friends. And that was the closest he ever got to really making it huge. But he had a season of a show where he was the star for Comedy Central. It was not a good show, called Frankie Goes to the Orient. It's goofy and weird. And I don't think that great, but had great moments, and it was so cool to see Stan, being the lead of a show. Great guy. And he still gets royalty checks for that show because that one season gets put on the air in the most random-ass countries. But the check he gets every month is like 10 cents because the show's worth jack.
Right. Yeah, you're not.
It really is just filler. So, no. So, and I'm over exaggerating a little bit. It's usually like $1.40. Woo! That pays for maybe a coffee in New York. So, what voice union or the voice strike by the union is trying to say is, this isn't royalties. This is session fees. So it's not about, hey, we've hit milestones. That means you're going to keep getting paid more, because there aren't royalties set up in the games industry. A session fee refers to what you're paid to be in the booth. What's interesting is they're trying to get sessions down to 3 hours. Apparently that's been the norm for a bunch of these game companies for a while, which is nuts. I always understood it as 4 hours and 2 hour blocks. 2 hour for a commercial kind of thing, like what I've done for Subway or other stuff, for radio commercials, or a 4 hour session, let's say. But apparently a lot of the times it's 3 with games. So what that means is you are paid for 3 hours to be in the booth. Now you could be done in 20 minutes technically, and you get paid for your 3 hour session. You're just paid for that full 3 hours of your day. Idea is the concept behind it. It's how a lot of the contracts work in acting. It's like if you were to work as an extra on a film, you're paid, if it's a union job, you get paid $158 for 8 hours of work. You could be done in an hour, or it could be the full 8. But you're paid for those 8 hours. So you're technically on call for that until they tell you can leave, even if you do absolutely nothing. So when you're getting your job, like I'll use my example from commercials I've done. You ahead of time are told, so we're going to pay you, let's say it's $450 or $200 for the session. That's separate, and this is the hard part for me because since I haven't done video game acting specifically, I don't know how 100% the contracts are structured, but I just know how session fees work, so I understand what they're referring to. So you get paid for your session, and then with commercials you get paid for a buyout kind of thing, or the airtime. They don't do royalties anymore. Market, social media, online, it's changed so much. You don't do what it used to be was, you'd land your commercial on TV or your national commercial or your radio thing, and then you'd get paid for its usage, and the more it's used, the more you get paid. Now the contract works in kind of these buyout ideas of, all right, we paid you for your session fee, and then we're going to pay you a set fee, so I usually are, agreed upon by the union, understanding within the context, is it local, is it national, is it, whatever, regional. You then get paid for a certain amount of airtime. So with radio stuff, a lot of what I've done are tri-state area and local ads. So it'll be for the next, it's like a usage, that's what they call it. So for like a 6 week usage, that's $400, let's say, or $250. So now I'm getting paid my session fee and the usage, and that's it. Now there are weird kind of bylines of, I recorded a 15-second commercial and a 10-second commercial, which technically count as 2 different spots. So I got paid for 2 different spots, usage fee-wise, and the session fee. So there are weird ways that can balance out. And so that one day of work, which was 2 hours, I got paid $800. That's a pretty great day.
Yeah, I wouldn't mind that day.
Now, the flip side of that reality, though, is that most actors, and all actors are working actors, even if they're not really getting, legally you can say you're a working actor if you got paid $500 as an actor, because they need to make it so lax for you to have write-offs because the business is so extreme. So they create all these tax breaks. I mean, it's so dumb. There's a reason why everyone says you should only do this if you really truly love it and think there's nothing else you could do to be happy. Because, and thankfully I definitely fit in that mold. But you're just asking to be miserable. Because people don't work as actors. There are far more actors in LA than there are in New York. And in New York, it's still technically like 1 million plus people.
Well, that's like,
and they're trying for 4,000 jobs.
That's like
maybe.
The joke when you're in LA is that every one of your servers and like bartenders, all of them are actors,
especially in that city.
Or they're a writer.
Because that city is, because that's what's interesting, especially about LA, which is why I was using the New York example. Is New York it has a huge acting contingency. It's huge. Again, it's like close to 1 million of people who claim they're actors. But this city isn't an acting city.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it doesn't give a damn if you're an actor. So, unlike LA, you can't close down a block to shoot your film. You have to have a PA on every corner saying, I would appreciate it if you just waited for us to get this shot in. But I've been on sets where you just see people be like, fuck this. I got places to be. I'm walking through.
I'm
it's
a New
like,
Yorker,
okay,
so I'm going to
we
walk
got to
through.
reset Megan Fox. We're going to reset Megan Fox, and this is going to kill an extra 60 seconds. And so much money is wasted on those big projects because 60 seconds is 60 seconds of 400 people's time. You know? And like I said before about those, you know, you get paid for your up until 8 hours worth of stuff, but the second it passes that 8-hour mark, you start getting paid overtime. And there are a lot of crazy things in terms of how that multiplies as time goes on. And there's something specifically called golden time, which is for every first minute you get paid a full hour of your rate at double. It's nuts.
Crap. Wow.
You almost never get to golden because sets will, even if you're way behind, oftentimes they will calculate it and be like, fuck it, we'll start again another day. We'll find the day because we don't want to pay these people this much money.
Right. No, that'd be insane. Yeah.
But that's also
logistically
why,
that just
on the
doesn't
flip
make
side,
sense.
that's why unions are good, because that rule is in place so that you cannot overwork your actors.
Right. Right.
And by the way, everyone on the set specifically.
Yeah.
Because it's not just the actors when it comes to film and TV sets, which is going to be important to think about when coming back to the video game stuff. So the idea with the main thing the union wants for voice performances is a payout every 2 million copies sold up to 8 million. So again, that means a session fee. So it's not some crazy bonus that's not predetermined. It's whatever you were paid to be in the booth to do your job. So whatever you were paid for your day of work. Now, and again, with some people in the games industry, that can be, you know, a couple $1,000 or more than that. Especially when you're getting into the more crazy stuff of the mocap and all the rest of it, or how big is your role? You know, how much dialogue are you really doing? And what kind of game? Is it an Elder Scrolls game where clearly they're not all the time having a director in the room being like, no, I need you to say it a little bit differently. A lot of those roles are recorded from people's personal studios at home where they have a room or a closet that's soundproofed. And they're given their, you know, junk lines. I don't mean junk in the sense of it's useless, but junk in the sense of it's random people in the world saying this dialogue.
Here's your
and
list of things that you have to say.
Yeah, hey, we just need you to record, you know, these as different characters and these different voices. And a lot of the people who work on, you know, Bethesda games and all the rest of it are people who've been working on Bethesda games forever, so they know what they've got to do.
Right.
But that's also why a lot of that stuff can feel and sound so stilted in a game. It's because there's no oversight. They're just recording these lines.
Right. Going back to Naughty Dog, that's the great thing, is they actually have them in the mocap suits. They're interacting with each other. They're moving around, so it doesn't feel forced. Because I've heard a lot of people say it's hard to do voice acting the first time because you're not, like, you don't have to actually interact with individuals. And
yeah, it's just you and the page and a mic.
Right.
Because usually whatever your scene partners aren't there.
Right.
So there's no reacting, which is, of course, acting is reacting is the old cliche, and it's true. It's all about how you bounce back and forth. If someone says something cruelly to you, you respond to it because it was a cruel comment. You don't just move on accordingly.
Right. Same thing, like if you tell a joke, it's you're naturally going to be smiling in response, so your what you say is going to have like an uplift in your voice, and
it's going to be better.
Yeah,
always better to have that kind of play. But that's also just not how, especially video game voice acting works. Which, and we'll finish up. I'll finish up actually before we move on to that point. But so the idea is, and this is one that amazes me when people are so against it. Because again, everyone's like, oh, they want royalties. No, they don't. The idea is if you made a shit ton of money on your game by selling 2 million, 4 million, 6 million, 8 million copies, is to basically get paid what I did for that. Let's say it was one day only. Now, of course, if I work 10 days, that doesn't mean I'm getting 10 session fees. I'm getting one session fee as a bonus each time. So it's whatever my rate was working on the project, I will get that again as a bonus.
Right, which I think
is not that crazy, actually.
It's not that crazy, and I think this is where we talk about misinformation. When you have a layperson like me, when you're hearing it, it does come across exactly what you're saying as legitimate bonuses. So I think, hey, you made $1 million, I'm owed 2, 3, 4% of that.
No.
Something crazy like you do with like Robert Downey in for Iron Man.
Back end stuff, sure, but that's because he's Robert Downey and he argued that contract.
That's how it comes across, though.
I know. But I'm just laughing because it's like It's like the only people I know who really get away with that are like him and Jack Nicholson on Batman. Like that's
Right.
really it.
Yeah.
It's all about bargaining power. But yeah, and one thing again, some people, it seems extreme, but it's true. It goes back to that idea of everyone's an actor, is that it really is. And if you're taking LA, it's multiple millions of people for, again, only thousands of jobs. So yeah, you could get that if you're not the Troy Bakers, the Ashley Johnsons, the Laura Baileys, the Nolan Norths of the world, who are working like crazy. And there are many more, the more animation side of voice actors, the John DiMaggios of the world, the Tara Strongs, tons of people. But if you're not those marquee names that people use to also sell the game, to be like, yeah, we got some talent here. Jennifer Hales, of course. But like, you could work, again, just do a few voices on a thing, and you got paid $400. Now, I know that's still a lot, $400 for a day of work, and it's not even a day, it's a few hours. That's awesome.
Yeah.
It's kick ass.
But it's a downtime.
Which is why when it's good, it's good. But the reality is, on average, that one day of work is what that actor's going to have as an actor for the next 3 months. And there's a lot of, and this is just the super depressing side of the business, but again, when you're not the glamorous side of it, when you're really an actor and not a lister, like an A-lister, B-lister kind of thing, a star, you got to worry about, and you actually do have to worry about appearance. You can write off a lot of stuff. You can actually write off on taxes clothes you buy and gym memberships and stuff, so it's a little bit more, again, compensated, but it doesn't really help. You still got to pay those fees. I mean, you need to be fit. If you're not at least moderately, put together, not with voice acting, but like, as an actor, you got to work out, or you got to commit to being fat. It sounds ridiculous, but like legitimately.
Yeah, you have to actually
kind of have to decide
go
what
one
you're
way or the other.
And there's some people who can function in the middle, but that's because they have a very specific look and they can really pull it off. Otherwise, you got to commit to, it's not about being perfect looking, but it's either like, I got to try to take care of myself, or I don't care. And even the people who, quote unquote, don't care, I bet they could outwork most people in a gym. It's just somehow built around the fact that they still got to keep their giant stomach. Like it's weird. You're also dealing with every half a year, sometimes faster, depending on how you're changing looks, new headshots. And what those are, your photograph of your head and usually a bit of torso. Sometimes it can be full body, oh, that's rare. And that's what you hand in with your resume every time you go into an audition. And if you don't have headshots that look current, you get judged. And by judged, I don't just mean the simple thing of like, oh, this doesn't really look like you. If it doesn't look like you, like you are when you walk in the room. Now, facial hair versus no facial hair, you can always be like, look, normally I'm shaved, but right now for a job it's different, so I'm keeping those headshots. But I've been in auditions and I've seen people, again, not when you're a star, but this is the reality for everyone else. 99% of the people who are actors. If your headshot isn't good, you get told off about it, being like, this doesn't look like you. And unless you really nail your performance in that audition, they kind of write you off for that. Classes, taking classes to constantly, if you're not working on shows and all the rest of it, to at least be working and constantly working on your craft, honing it and all the rest of it, costs money. The world used to be done by showcases. Now everything is this new pay-to-play model of you pay for time to be in the room with an agent, manager, or casting director. And technically it's for educational purposes, because if they don't say that, you can actually sue them. So it's totally for educational purposes and not in the hopes that they love your work and try to give you a job. It's the only reason why anyone does it, by the way, in any of the major cities. But legally, it's all for education, we swear. There was a whole Hollywood Reporter thing where people got fired because they weren't as careful in pretending it was for educational purposes. And an exec at, I think it was NBC, but don't quote me on that, basically was like, oh, yeah, no, we're doing this to look for people. And he lost his job because that's not legal. So most actors spend most of their income on just keeping up to date and maintenance to be a viable commodity. Make sure you have your website, the fees that go with that. It's a really weird world. So there's that thing of, oh my God, it looks like you're making so much money. Yeah, but it's there's a lot of weird superfluous shit you have to worry about
It's the net profit
that
at the end of the day.
bleeds out money, and it sounds so petty. And you know what it is? It's really fucking petty. But that's what we all signed up for. We signed up to be in the pettiest world. So it's also that like double-edged sword. Like I'm bitching and moaning, but it's like, but I knew it going in.
Right. And so to kind of turn this to games, here's kind of the rub how I'm looking at it is
Yeah, do it.
you have this dichotomy between the programmers who,
Mhm.
in all honesty,
Totally.
make the game, make the characters, make the person actually exist, and you have the voice actors who make those people, at least half of them, come to life. Right.
Yeah.
But the difference comes down to with those voice actors, these are individuals that are basically a consultant. So they're coming in, they're not getting their consistent 8 to 5. I'm going to get a salary, I'm going to get health benefits and whatnot. And so when you get into this interesting conversation of who should be protected, who should be getting these bonuses, who in the long term needs the steady compensation or the really, really like blowback from like we did really well with this game, we need to have somebody get a tremendous amount of bonus, it gets down to kind of this minutia and kind of back and forth of, well, this person programmed this, well, they really like the shooting, so that was this.
So,
but then you also have the element of like, well, this person also is getting a consistent like salary, they're getting a 401k, they're getting bonuses every year from their company because they actually exist at this company. Right.
So yeah, and that's the strange part is that taken in isolation, what the union is asking for makes total sense. And it's actually a bastardized and much weaker version of what the union has in place for every other part of media and entertainment. Just is. It's not nearly as good as what any of the other setups are. And I think I was going to get to this point later, but it feels a little organic to bring it up now, so why not? What's fascinating to me, and which is why I pretty much fall dead middle on this. I think the strike makes sense for certain reasons, and the main thing we'll get into, which is the second big point of why the strike is happening, which I think makes total sense, and the fact that people. So I guess what it is the main other part that people are fighting for is, or the union's trying to talk about, is transparency in games. Because when you're working on a project, so much is in secret. They don't want things leaked. So people when they're hired, they often have a character that they know in whatever game they're working on, but they don't know the name of the game. They don't know the plot of the game. They don't know where their character interacts with anything. They're just given a little bit of script. It doesn't happen in all games.
So counterintuitive to what you
expect. It is the dumbest thing. Now, I wrote in my little blurb of why, I fell in love with RPG Fan and blah, 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 blah. But in that blurb in my about, I mentioned that part of what really drove me into acting, I was already kind of down that road. And then that was early voiceover stuff in console games. So Metal Gear Solid and FF10 were two giant kind of transformative moments for me. But what always pissed me off is that Final Fantasy X has incredible talent behind its voices. And I know everyone makes fun of that game, but rightly so. And I think people give it too much of a break because it was one of the first voiceover games. But there's some of the best talent in the business on that game, and it sucks half the time. Like, it sucks.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Everybody always points out the laughing scene, but
yeah,
there's
but
plenty
that's
of
the
things
obvious one. But there's
like,
so much garbage. Like, but again, you read the name of that cast, and it's astounding. And a lot of it is, especially at the time, the practice was, even if you knew what game you were working on, you weren't really given a script ahead of time to work on. Normally when you work on a play, you work on a film, you work on a TV show, or any kind of content, you're given your whatever you're tasked with, unless you're a guest star, way ahead of time, weeks. And you get to create a character, think it out, read over the script, understand the nuance of how you interact, and through circumstances, what people say and all the rest of it, you create your character.
Well, you also are given the opportunity then to possibly refuse being on that because you don't.
Yes, because you actually know the project too.
Right.
That's also true. That is a good point. But just from a performance perspective, it's that idea of you actually have time to create something and work on it. Whereas oftentimes it still happens, is this weird thing of like, hey, you got this job on this project. You have no idea what it's about. And we're not going to tell you really anything except when you're in the room with us recording for those 3 hours and those 3 hours only. And we're just going to have to figure it out on the fly. And hopefully we get to where we want.
Right. Which is just sounds
And you
terrible.
still feel it, by the way, in so many games. Especially now when you have games that go above and beyond to make sure performance is great. Like we referenced the Naughty Dog. That's the easy, point to. Because they do
Fantastic work.
They do straight up performance. It's theater just being recorded digitally. And yeah, you see the difference between that and even if they didn't have mocap, just if they were in a room recording VO back and forth, like that has a huge difference. It's a weird reason why Metal Gear Solid was better than it should have been voice acting wise, is they actually had the talent together. They were in a really weird, ridiculous room. You should listen to that Game Informer podcast about the recording of all that dialogue. It's really fascinating. But like their conditions sucked. That game should not have sounded as good as it did considering. But they were in a room together, so they actually got to act and react. So a big thing that the strike is about is this idea of actually knowing what the hell you're working on so you can actually create a character and then not get penalized for people being like, oh, your performance sucked in that. It's like, yeah, I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
Like, apparently I was a dog. They never told me that.
Yeah.
I would have changed, everything. That makes so much more sense. So we should wrap this up. And I'm sorry that I'm probably
No, it's
rambling
fine.
a lot. But-
So I guess I can give a business perspective on this.
Yeah, please.
I've done a lot of business consulting work. I've also worked in very large corporations, and I've worked in startups. And so one of the big things is always compensation, understanding duties. Like I've been in charge of actually building. This is what you're going to be working on. So then, when you're hiring the people, they know, and then also when you're onboarding individuals.
Right.
And so on the transparency side, it makes no sense to me. It also makes no sense. It's very easy to draw parallels between video games and film. And with film, like, what films are coming out for the next 7-8 years. And I've always found it so intriguing that video games have to be so secretive about it. We're so secretive about it, but then we announce something where it's like 4 years advanced, and it's like, well, now we're going to have to hear little bits and pieces about this forever. Where in the film industry, it's like, all right, we already know, like, the next 5 years of Star Wars films and what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't actually find out any trailers, or we don't have any tidbits until 9 months before, maybe a year.
Mm-hmm.
And we do the exact opposite in video games. We don't tell anybody anything until 2 or 3 years, and then all of a sudden it's like, here's our first trailer, announcement trailer. And then you're going to get a trailer every 3 to 6 months until that game comes out. And so it just seems so... It seems backwards with that, in that regard.
And what I don't get is, like, you sign an NDA on pretty much every project. And I mean that from commercials to film to TV.
Any job
to
you will ever
video
do,
games.
you'll sign some sort of
and
NDA.
also that too. No, and you're totally right. But specifically, like, just in the perspective of, let's say, working on a video game, you're signing an NDA.
Right.
Now, people, of course, through resumes and things get leaked, and
Right. And that's the hard thing. Is you guys are always
and
looking
that's
for
more
your
about
next
how
job.
exactly. And when you work on something, you are allowed to put that on your resume. So maybe part of it has to be more creative and just mention the publishing company. But again, a lot of actors don't understand the video game business because they're just not gamers and
But
don't understand that
here's
cyclical
the
thing.
business perspective of this. If we don't want our games to be leaked by resumes, let's work with the voice actors in this regard. Let's actually announce
Yeah,
these
that's what I
games
mean.
are in development when we start development on them. And then
Well, I mean, that would be the easy solution.
Right.
But at the
problem
same,
solved.
yeah, I know. I mean, that is the easiest. Why isn't that happening thing? But even if, let's say, they're still stubborn and they don't want to, unveil that shit, then just let them say, let people be able to say, "Oh, I worked on this,"
Yep.
and then if someone says something on social media, yeah, don't hire them again because they just broke an NDA.
Yep.
And by the way, that's happened plenty of times. I think that's one of the main reasons why. I mean, no, there is no way to back this up. But there's certain actors that I was going to mention that aren't working in AAA games that did for a while and were getting major pushes by the publishers that were using them. And then certain leaks would happen on certain other games because of their social media or resume. And maybe they're not looking to be in the game space anymore, but there's a very good chance that they broke those contracts, and a lot of these companies are just like, no.
For the record,
No.
I don't know who he's talking about, so this isn't in parallel to that. But
Yeah.
literally every Assassin's Creed game has been leaked because of a voice actor.
Yeah. Yeah, or someone working on the game on
Yep.
Subway.
Yeah, that's the other one. Left their
I
phone or
love
their
that.
computer open.
I love it so much.
So the transparency one, I feel like that's something that's much easier. It's the pay that always gets
I know.
me.
I know.
That's
That's the
that's the
hard
hard
one.
one, and I can see both sides of it, and that's where I feel like I fall more in the middle line, like you said you did. Of I understand that you guys need compensation. I understand as a consultant because I've lived the consultant life and being concerned, like I just finished this big project. What am I going to do next?
Yeah.
But at the same time, to a certain degree, when I was a consultant, I realized I signed up for that.
Yes, and this is kind of my thing. Now, I guess before I get into it again, it's just like what they're the reason why I am so middle ground on this and I'm such a devil's advocate is that the milestones they're hitting and they're asking for compensation for are not like that means the companies did well. It's
Right.
not like, hey, we're asking for something when we don't deserve it.
And these
They're
milestones
2 million.
are much smaller than I thought they were.
Yeah, and it ends at 8 million. And again, their session fee. Again, yes, your session fee could be way more expensive depending on the role. And I see how companies would be against it because there's a difference between, oh, there was a core cast of 5 people who worked on this game, and yeah, there were other people who did voices, but their session fee is only going to be $150, $200, whatever. Again, I'm making up numbers, but I'm just trying to create the scale in a listener's head. But technically, with an open world game, maybe you had 800 actors
Right.
or 1,000 actors, even if they were just doing a few lines, because you wanted that variety. Now, I don't. That's not how it works. Usually, you just get a bunch of people to do a bunch of
different
voices. But again, I'm just making a point. I think it's more on the principle of it that there's an issue, because again, the quote unquote compensation is for again 99% of the actors who this would affect. It's going to be really minimal.
Right.
It's really going to be that $200 check. But there are a few people who that check is going to be way, way, way bigger.
Right. And that's where it
So that's the hard part. The other issue is we're talking about a union that it doesn't always win, but it has spent a lot of time manicuring its structure. And by that I mean the film industry and the TV industry, radio, SAG dictates rules. The unions dictate a lot of how that functions. And so do, the gaffers union, the lighting union, all that stuff. There are set precedents on how everything works. And it's all about tweaking. And for years and years and years, whenever there's bargaining, it's all about tweaking. Video games are a new frontier.
Right.
I really do believe that. And I don't mean that in the sense of, yeah, of course, there's been video game acting for a while. It's not new. But in terms of the union really focusing on it, I think because of Telltale and what they're doing, because of how Naughty Dog does their stuff, people like Ninja Theory when they brought in oh god, I'm forgetting his name. Yeah, thank you. And how they also did motion capture. A lot of studios care much more about the writing and the performance now. And what's sad is it feels like this is the first time the union recently noticed, oh, we should care.
Well, in all honesty, the 360 and the PS3 era was kind of the transition from, hey, these are a bunch of dorks that are playing with these toys in their basement, to this is actually
Hey, we're going to go to super in-depth, mature stuff. And you had flavors of it, but not on that AAA scale.
I think that was kind of where the society as a whole made that
with you
switch.
1,000%.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, a lot of this, to me, again, not the transparency thing, that makes total sense, but the compensation, it felt like, how do we figure out a creative way to benefit? And while I do think it is incredibly beneficial to, like I said, a vast majority of people, and it really would make a difference, because it's a bonus structure, instead of it just being, hey, let's figure out primary compensation and maybe make, hiring, I'm not saying, get a huge bonus, but maybe you worry about that a little bit more, the actual payment, instead of how do I get a bonus? It just feels like they're trying to figure out what they can get.
Right.
I don't want to make a writer's strike analogy because that was totally different. It gave us reality TV, which was depressing. But that wonderful South Park of like, we want that internet monies.
Right.
It's like, well, what the hell do you mean you want the internet monies? Now, this isn't nearly close to that.
Right. And
To say that as much, I deserve a little bit of hate for that. But
it's hard to compare it to film because film's had the last
it's its own world. It's totally
50,
different.
60
Exactly.
years to actually get this to a point that
and so the
acceptable.
union is taking everything it understands from that world and saying, yeah, we're going to do the same thing here. And yes, what they're trying to argue for is different from what film and television has and radio and all that. They're trying to create their own rules, but again, this is a system, like you said, those games get made for 4 years,
right.
3 years, 2 years, and you are, as the performer, the final touch. Now, in many ways, in movies, that's also kind of how
it's
it
also
works.
True.
Yes. Yeah, it is, but much more so than in games because it's your actual likeness usually, and even if it is your likeness in a game, still someone has to animate you and do all this crazy shit. It's a lot more evident how many hands are in play. Yeah. How many fingers touch everything in games, whereas in film and TV, if you're focused on the shot, usually it's because someone did something wrong. Not because usually you want to be focused on whatever the camera's showing you, and that's it. If you're thinking about the technical side of it, yes, on some occasions it's because they've nailed it so perfectly that you're like, wow, that is just exquisite looking or horrifying or whatever. But most of the time it's because someone messed up or it doesn't look as good as it should. That's the only reason why you think about everyone else. And to an extent, there's a little bit of that in the game. You only really focus on, oh yeah, it's a game when it gets broken or some random glitch happens. But I think it is so much more clear in a game to be like, there was an animator or a sculptor who just worked on this map. That was his job, this level. And those 3 people made an outstanding, design choice and created something special. And then I get to walk through it.
Right. Yeah, it gets much harder. I think the best way to kind of sum this up is we're stuck in a lot of in-betweens.
Please.
We're in a new frontier. We're still trying to figure everything out. I think we're going to continue to hear stories about this as the years go by as we try to figure this out because it is I think you brought up a good point. It's a continual process, and unfortunately we're at the very front end of this. So there's going to be lots of arguments. There's going to be lots of hurt feelings. But hopefully we can ultimately find a solution that is both good for the voice actors, good for the programmers, good for the companies, and most importantly, good for us as the people that get to enjoy the entertainment.
Because I would like to work in games.
Yeah.
And I can't really leave the union, so gotta figure that out.
So if you'd like to hire Chris, that'd be wonderful.
That'd be amazing. You let me know. I live in New York.
Reach out to him on Twitter.
Supergiant, you're 1 borough away. That's all I'm saying.
So we really appreciate you listening to this very, very different podcast. It is a very interesting topic. We could probably talk for another 10 hours about this.
Yes, but we shouldn't because it's boring.
We're going to stop here. We'd love to hear your guys' thoughts, though, so please reach out on the boards, on Twitter to us. Send your emails to retro@rpgfan.com. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Come gather round, children, it's high time he learns about a hero named Homer and a devil named Burns. We'll march till we drop, the girls and the fellas. We'll fight till the death or else fold like umbrellas. So we'll march day and night by the big cooling tower. They have the plant, but we have the power.